Hi, welcome to Outside Ourselves, a show featuring conversations that remind us faith isn't something we do, it's something we receive. I'm Kelsi. Outside Ourselves is a part of the 1517 Podcast Network. To learn more about all of our podcasts and all of our shows, please go to 1517.org/podcasts. Today I'm chatting with David Andersen. David is an author and a theologian. David's new book, What Can We Really Know? The Strengths and Limits of Human Understanding, just came out with 1517 Publishing earlier this year. David and I start by talking about this book, but we kind of dovetail into a larger conversation about the relationship between faith and reason. What role does reason play in validating our faith as Christians? And we also deal with this question of, once we are Christians, what role does reason have to play and what relationship does it have with our faith? And with that, here's today's show. David, thanks so much for being here, especially we are recording right now on a weekend, so I really appreciate your time. It's good to see you. I'm excited to chat some more.
Thanks for having me. This should be fun.
Yeah. So I know a little bit about you, but I don't know very much. I know that you have a PhD from Oxford. I know you've written several books at this point, but I also believe that you have a full-time job in something that's completely separate from theology. So I'm wondering if you can just tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and kind of how you are able to split your time.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I don't know if I'm able to, it's hard to split my time, but I do. So I got my PhD, actually, we were mentioning Adam before, but I got my PhD in, I think, 2000 is when I finished.
Okay.
I did a PhD under Alison McGrath at Wycliffe Hall, Oxford. I went from there I did a little stint at Fort Wayne Seminary. I don't know if you knew that.
I didn't know that.
I was working toward ordination, and then I got a full-time teaching job at Concordia Ann Arbor. So that's where I ended up teaching for a couple of years, and I taught at Eastern Michigan University. And before that, when I was at the when I was at the seminary, I taught for Indiana Purdue University in Fort Wayne, and so that's kind of my academic background.
Yeah.
In 2000, let me think here. I have to go way back now. In like 2002, I had this massive student loan and realized, I'm not going to be able to pay this, Oxford debt from a professor's salary. So my brother and I actually started a software company in 2002, and that's what I've been doing ever since. I'm the president of the software company, and we have a small firm in Utah.
Okay, that's kind of crazy that you had to leave academia to pay for academia, but
yeah,
I'm glad it worked out. It sounds
it did.
like...
I was able to. I write a lot. I continue to write a lot, as you've mentioned. I've written, I think, three books in the past 4 or 5 years, something like that. So I feel like, and I'm continuing. So it's fine. I'm able to research now, probably more than I could when I was a professor.
That's interesting.
Just because, as a professor, a lot of times you're teaching 4 to 5 classes a semester, and at least I was having to teach 4 for Concordia and then 1 for Eastern Michigan University, just to make ends meet. And it's exhausting. And by the time you finish for the day, you're just exhausted. So this way is a little bit better for me. I can get my fill of business during the day, and then at nights and weekends do research for books.
I mean, you mentioned that you've written about 3 books in the last 5 years, and these are not like 100-page books. These are pretty dense, extensive books. And your newest one, which came out, I think this spring for 1517, is called What Can We Really Know? Can you tell us a little bit about the book, what it's about, and also why you were interested in writing it in the first place?
I was born and raised a Mormon, and I don't know if you knew that, but uh, I think when I came out of Mormonism, I was 17 or something like that, somewhere around there. I become intensely interested in this question of faith and reason. What is the
Mm,
relationship between faith and reason, and can reason give us? Can it validate faith in any way?
yeah.
And so I was challenged, when I came out of Mormonism, I was challenged by a good friend of mine at the time who happened to be a Christian, and he uh, I'm grateful that he knew the historical argument for Jesus's resurrection from the dead,
Yeah.
because as a person who was just coming out of a system that said that you just need to have faith, and it was all about the burning in the bosom and the religious
Mm,
experience. Uh, uh, I was not going to have any of that. So if a Christian would have said to me, "Well, you just need to have faith. You need to experience God," I would have gone, "No way, no,
yeah.
thank you." But luckily, this guy got me down this path of evidence-based belief. So I think my interest in the topic goes all the way back
For
to
sure.
my experience as a teenager, as a
Mm,
late teen. In terms of what prompted the book itself, I think it was probably COVID.
hmm.
If I'm honest,
Yeah.
there were a lot of claims being made about how best to deal with what was happening, and they often came across with this air of certainty. And we're absolutely, you just felt from the news, we're certain this is what it is, and this is how we deal with it. We need to shut things down. And it was it was alarming to me, as somebody who had been a philosophy professor and understands that knowledge is not that easy. We can
Mm,
never be certain about things like this, and
yeah.
things tend to change, and they did change. And it seemed that as COVID went on, things changed. The orthodoxy changed all the time,
Right. Right.
and so it prompted me to really examine. Well, let's really ask the questions how certain knowledge can be. What is the social component of knowledge? I mean, we're all influenced by media. We're all influenced by our social groups.
Mm-hmm.
None of us lives in a box. None of us was born and raised by lions in the wilderness. We have social components to knowledge, and so I wanted to examine, what kind of role does that play in our claims to know? So I think
Mm-hmm.
that's what prompted it. Now, your first question is, what do I really talk about? Well, those are the questions. How do we know? What can we know? How certain can we be? How does that social component play in what we claim to know? And as far as I know, this is one of the only books that has it all in one place, because I not only deal with the area of epistemology, which is just a fancy word philosophers use for a theory of knowledge. It simply asks the
Right.
question, how do we know what we know? It's that simple.
Right.
But of
Mm-hmm.
course, philosophers have to come up with big words, and they're like lawyers. We get paid by the how long the word is. Although in my case, I didn't get paid very well, right? Um, so I deal with epistemology, but the other thing that I deal with is this social element, the social
Mm,
epistemology. It's if you read a philosophy textbook, it's pretty normal for them to talk about the epistemological questions, the knowledge questions, but it's not so normal to bring in that social component. And
yeah.
if you think about what we know, most of it is by testimony. Most of it is
Mm-hmm.
by being told by somebody else, and that is an important question.
Yeah.
How justified are we in believing those that we listen to?
Mm-hmm.
We were told endless times during COVID, for example, that you got to listen to the experts, you got to listen to the science. And so that's one component. The other component is I deal with the philosophy of science in a lot of detail in this book.
Mm,
And then I wrap up the knowledge section with talking about some of the latest psychological research from heuristics and biases research. One thing I should mention is at the end of the book, I deal with the latest arguments for God's existence as well.
What you kind of said at the forefront, and you talk a little bit about, I know in your introduction as well, as the certainty traps of our day and age, I found really interesting, because I think a lot of times, and maybe even especially Christians, tend to bemoan, instead of the lack of, or like the amount of certainty that's happening for people, the widespread amount of doubt that's happening for people, as the issue. Like, we can't, postmodernism has brought all this doubt in, and we can't agree on anything. And that's really, we need to figure out how to deal with that. I feel like a lot of Christians are starting there. Can you talk about the relationship between those two? Because I definitely see what you're talking about as a huge issue, but there is also, I think, this element of and it affects Christians in particular too. I see this happen for Christians a lot of times. Maybe someone's coming out of like a fundamentalist background, and they are done with certainty, they're sick of it, and they go way to the opposite side, where they're more of a fideist, or just kind of okay being like, well, we can't know anything. Can you talk about that interplay and how those two are related?
You're right. There is the opposite side. And what I argue in this book is that we have to recognize two things. And one of them is that first of all, and most importantly, we do have knowledge of certain things. We do have secure knowledge of certain things. So that in and of itself is a rejection of postmodernism. It's a rejection of social constructivism. And postmodernism and social constructivism, for your hearers, simply is the view, what you said, that says that everything that we know is socially constructed, and none of it has any basis in none of it's objective. None of it's true or false. True and false are almost false categories here, because these are just social constructions. They're useful. They get us what we need out of life. They allow us to move forward. But one thing that they don't give us is truth. So I reject postmodernism and social constructivism as illegitimate. And one big argument against postmodernism and social constructivism is, and this is really simple, if you're going to say that there is no such thing as truth, that all things are relative. And I think it's important, we talked about the universities a few minutes ago. I think it's important to recognize that you'll find both of these elements in the university. You'll find those who have this absolute certainty about things, and then those who say, well, we don't have any knowledge of anything. And social constructivism it's big in the universities. Any university you go to these days, you're going to find a lot of people that are going to argue there is no truth. And to say that there's no truth is itself, I argued that postmodernism and social constructivism falls on its own axe. Because if you're going to tell me that there is no truth, then the statement that there is no truth can't be true. I mean, how do you justify, how does the postmodernist or the social constructivist justify the statement that there is no truth, if there is no truth? Because they're assuming at least their statement is true. Nobody else's statements are true, but at least their statement about there being no truth is true. So it's a non-starter. It's hard to even take it seriously for me, and it's a little strange to me that it is taken so seriously. Now, having said that, I do think that there's a good reason for making a distinction between the strong and weak constructivist program, social constructivist program, and the weak constructivist program is just what I argued in the book, and that is it's simply a recognition that the knowledge that we have is a social product. And if you think about that, well, everything that we know is a social product. It comes from it comes from learning, it comes from background, it comes from new discoveries, and those discoveries themselves depend on how we view things at the time. Scientific
Mm.
theories themselves depend on how we view things at the time, and scientific theories change over time. So that's all it's saying. That's all it's saying is that
Yeah.
knowledge is a social product. Now, the strong constructivist program is what you're going to hear parroted in so many universities these days, and that says there's no truth.
Right.
That's the program that I reject. So
Yeah.
in the book I try to keep these two elements in full force but in tension, and that is we do have knowledge of some things, and knowledge is a social product. It's not an either or, it's a both and.
I'm kind of curious. This is going back again to kind of one of the first things you said, but I'm really just curious about to hear a little bit more about how you came out of Mormonism, what that experience was like for you, and how Christianity was tied. Was there, because you mentioned this Christian friend that kind of gave you
Yeah.
some evidential help along the way. Was that all kind of in succession, or was it a little bit more fragmented? And I'm curious about this because I think there are a lot of Christians, whether they have converted later in life or they're just uh, trying to figure out where they stand now in relation to the world, that are not sure that they can stand on their belief. They're not sure that they can prove anything to anybody. So I'm curious what your personal experience was like with that.
Yeah, we do need to cover that because you brought up the issue of fideism, and I think that we need to
Yeah.
talk about that. And
Mm.
I'll define that term in a second.
Okay.
Let me just say right off the bat, that's a really important point. And part of what I deal with in this book is those really, really recent arguments for God's existence. And it's important to realize that Christians ever since Darwin published The Origin of Species. So it's been a long time,
Yeah.
19th century, where Christians kind of went into retreat.
Mm.
Science is claiming to have disproven the need for God.
Right.
So we're going to go into retreat and not have evidence-based arguments for the faith, which is a tragedy.
Yeah.
And it also highlights just how great of a man C.S. Lewis was, and we all know he was a great man. But if you think of the time he lived in, this was a time when the clergy was in full retreat. They were
Mm.
not presenting arguments, and here is a non-clergyman at Oxford and Cambridge coming out and making these really detailed and articulate arguments
Yeah.
for God's existence and why
Mm.
Christianity is true. And I think we're even more able to do that now with the latest research in Big Bang cosmology, in evolutionary biology. I mean, let's talk to the non-Christian about what we believe. We have the stronger argument,
Yeah.
and some of those arguments are dealt with in my latest book. But
Mm-hmm.
your question was really around my coming out of Mormonism, and I'm gonna have to like shake the cobwebs off my memory here, but I think that the people I had a chance to meet one person in particular who was, believe it or not, a martial art instructor of mine,
Okay.
and he happened to be a Christian. I was a Mormon at the time, very, very Mormon, and he was kind of working on me from multiple perspectives. And
Hmm.
first of all, he challenged me about my Mormonism. He said, "Hey, look, have you ever taken a look at Mormon history?" And I was like, well, I thought I knew a lot about Mormon history. I mean, I was born and raised it. I was planning on going on a mission at age 19. And it turns out I didn't know the first thing about Mormon history. And so
Hmm.
he introduced me to some researchers here in Salt Lake, Sandra and Gerald Tanner. Gerald has now passed away. They run the Utah Lighthouse Ministry, and they've done a tremendous amount of research on the origins of Mormonism, and they've been able to, photocopy and publish these original Mormon documents, and they're, for a Mormon, they were really disturbing. And
Yeah.
so I came out of Mormonism by researching Mormon history. Now, that didn't mean I was a Christian. I think I tended to, I was very much in flux. I was, in that stage where I was wondering, well, is there even a God? Or then I
Right.
went into a little Buddhist stage because I was in that martial art arena. And then the same person was able to say, hey, look, one thing you may want to consider is this argument for Jesus's resurrection from the dead, and it's an argument that's based on history, based on
Yeah.
fact. And in my book, I do present that argument as the last chapter, because
Right.
I still think that, as strong as the cosmological arguments are, and those are just arguments that say, that start with the existence of the universe and then reason back to an ultimate cause, okay, which
Mm-hmm.
would be God.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And they have relative strengths. The one weakness they have is that they don't necessarily imply the Christian God, right? That's something
Right.
that
Yeah.
a lot of people would bring up, and so they do have some weaknesses. But I'd really encourage Christians to use those, because there are some people who maybe some atheists, maybe some agnostics out there, who really need to be prepared a little bit more by giving some evidence that, hey, science, it's not what you hear on the radio, and it's not what you hear in the media. Science is not able to tell you God doesn't exist, and in fact, the evidence seems to swing the other direction. If
Right.
science is implying anything, it's implying that there must be an ultimate cause to the universe.
Hmm.
So I think that the arguments, those cosmological arguments, from Big Bang theory, and even if you were to grapple with some of the implications of evolutionary biology, I think that those can be really strong arguments. But ultimately, what we want to do is lead people to Jesus, right? We want to
Right.
lead people to the cross.
Yeah.
And that was the argument that really got me. It was
Mm-hmm.
the argument that said, look, there's a lot of evidence that shows that Jesus rose from the dead.
Mm-hmm.
Not many days after he was crucified. And so, yeah, I think that was the one that really got to me, and that's why I present that argument as the last chapter in this book, because I think that it encapsulates not only an argument for God's existence, but for Jesus as Messiah.
Yeah. Could you, I mean, I remember, I didn't, I think as I was starting to get more into theology in the last few years, heard this argument presented very clearly with, a name, the historical argument for Jesus for the first time. I knew some of it from growing up as a Christian, but could you just kind of walk us through a little bit of what makes up that argument, or maybe some of the
Absolutely.
parts that you think are most compelling? Just because I think there are a lot of Christians that have not heard it, and I think it's pretty whether whoever's listening is a Christian or not, I think it is, like you're saying, it's a very compelling argument that's worth kind of hearing out.
It is, and my book called Faithless to Fearless, this is all I deal with.
Okay.
So I present the argument in summary form in What Can We Really Know?
Yeah.
And there I'm really dealing with knowledge, right? I'm dealing with, how secure is knowledge and that sort of thing. And I do present the argument with in summary in that book. So if you want a good summary, that's a great place to go. If you want a more sustained, defense of it, then it's Faithless to Fearless, the book Faithless
Okay.
to Fearless.
That's great
But
to
the
know.
argument is simple. You have different versions of it. And the version that I have really proposed is what's called the minimal facts approach.
Okay.
And the reason I like this is because it makes the least assumptions. So I live in a space where there are not a lot of Christians where I live, and I don't know where you live. That may be different, but I'm always in this situation where I'm speaking to people who are different than me, and I know a lot of atheists. Where I live, you kind of have you tend to have people divided into camps, and you have the really strong Mormons over here, but there are a lot of people who come out of the Mormonism and reject everything out of hand, and so they become really, really strong atheists. And I think it's important to be able to have conversations with the atheist. And what I like about the minimal facts approach is that it only takes a few core facts, and I'll name them in just a second, that all of us can agree on. So even the atheist will agree. Even the atheist scholar will agree. And the facts are these. The first is that Jesus died by crucifixion and was buried. It's that simple. Now, you might go, well, so what? Even in the 20th century, it was being disputed by some scholars whether Jesus even existed, right?
Right.
Whether he was even, the arguments were never good. But like so many fads in the universities, things spread like wildfire, and ideas do spread like viruses, I think. Yeah. And it's called, actually, I deal with that in my latest book. But this is something we can all agree on. Agnostic, atheist, and Christian can all agree on the core fact that Jesus died by crucifixion and was buried. Okay, so that's the first one. The second one is that shortly after his crucifixion, his disciples claim to have seen him risen from the dead. Now, your listeners may be wondering, well, wait a minute, why would an atheist agree to that? Because isn't that what they dispute? No. What we're saying is atheist, agnostic, and Christian all accept the fact that they claim to have seen him risen from the dead. That's an important point. Of course, an atheist is going to say, well, he didn't rise from the dead, and their claims are unjustified, and they have reasons for the claims. But we'll talk about those in a second. The third one that we would consider a core fact would be 1 to 3 years after the crucifixion, after the crucifixion and the disciples claimed that he rose from the dead, Saul of Tarsus claimed to have been confronted by the risen Jesus on the road to Damascus. Now, I think this fact alone speaks volumes, because Saul of Tarsus was a Pharisaic Jew of the highest order. He was on a mission to persecute Christians. He was standing there nodding in agreement as Stephen was stoned to death. And his orders were to go imprison Christians. That was what he was doing. And at the very moment that he was breathing threats against the Christian faith, he has this about face, right? And is confronted by the risen Jesus and becomes one of the greatest Christian thinkers of all time. So that, by the way, that fact alone, books have been written on that fact alone, and need to be written on that fact alone, because this is no small thing,
right? Yeah.
And he was not connected with the 12, originally. He didn't know them, so it's not like he was part of the group. And no, he was trying to persecute them. I add 2 more, and these are, I think, important as well. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 8. There are some verses that we know were not written by Paul, and which is interesting. And Paul just gives the Corinthians a formula that he had learned prior. And the formula was, Jesus was, he rose from the dead. He lists, and basically the formula is a list of eyewitnesses.
Yeah.
And then at the end of that formula, he says, and there were 500 others. Now, Paul is saying that because he's telling his readers, this in itself is considered an ancient tradition, and scholars universally agree that Paul probably received that formula almost right after he became a Christian. So in other words, it goes back to within just a few years of the crucifixion itself, which means that it is way too primitive, way too early to have been fabricated. That's the point of this, is as it's much too ancient. It's much too ancient to be considered a myth or a fabrication. Because a lot of the arguments about Christianity or against Christianity have been along the lines of, well, this idea of Jesus' resurrection slowly evolved out of their disappointment. And no, it didn't. It was there from the beginning. It erupted like a big bang. And then the other thing that I talk about is that's just like this in terms of erupting like a big bang is the idea that Jesus is God. That did not evolve either. That didn't happen over a process of evolution. It was instantaneous, and it came out like a big bang. It was there from the very beginning. Now, people are going, well, so what? So they believe Jesus is God. Well, if you want to know why that's so highly implausible, you can read Faithless to Fearless, because there was no expectation of a Messiah being God or dying by death of a crucifixion. And the scholar N.T. Wright has written about this extensively in his book Resurrection of the Son of God. And the argument is, as far as I'm concerned, as tight as an argument could be. So those are the core facts. And what you do with those then, as you say, look, what is the likeliest explanation of these core facts? And the argument proceeds by saying, look, the most plausible explanation of those 5 facts that I've just presented to you are that Jesus actually rose from the dead. That explains those facts better than any of the alternative explanations. Now, there are alternative explanations. They run from, the disciples stole the body. Nobody really takes that very seriously, by the way. The most popular argument is the hallucination theory. And
that's so funny that that's the most popular to me.
Because that's the least plausible in my mind.
Yeah.
There's no scientific research that would support such a theory. No medical research that would support such a theory. When people have hallucination, they have different hallucinations. Right. And they're always different. And there's no such thing as mass hallucination, like what we're talking about here in terms of the claims that are made about Jesus. So I deal with those in Faithless to Fearless. But I think, back to your original assertion, that Christians have a lot to stand on. And we need to be talking to unbelievers about these core facts, because they're on our side. And the argument that the only thing that it really explains these is Jesus' actual physical resurrection from the dead in the first century. It's very, very strong.
What I have found as a continual roadblock or obstacle is less the fact that, these arguments are really helpful. I believe them. It's more getting to the point with someone where they will even listen, because we are so confused about what knowledge is these days. There's not like a general consensus. It's hard to even, most people don't really even want to have a conversation about evidence. It seems, and these are broad statements. I know that this is not true for everyone, but that's I guess that's maybe the frustration that I can sometimes have, is it feels like I can't even get to that point with a person. What would you say is a good starting point? Do we need to start with more of a conversation about what knowledge is? Do we need to start more on like a relationship side? And I'm sure, I feel like a lot of times this comes down to it depends on the person, which is helpful, but curious kind of what you found to work, and how your research on epistemology and knowledge has played into that.
That's a hard question. That's a good
Yeah.
question. Really good question, but I'm not sure that there's an easy answer to it. I do
Yeah.
think, the older I get, the more I realize it does come down to relationships, of course. I mean,
Yeah.
people are not going to listen. People are not going to listen to people who they don't have a relationship with them. And
Right.
why should we, right?
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
and I think it's human nature, but I do think it depends on where the person is. And I think it's really important to be able to meet a person where they are. And that may just be having to go back a little bit instead of just jumping into a historical argument or talking about what Big Bang cosmology might imply. Maybe we have to go back and challenge the person about the issue of knowledge.
Mm.
If they're in this position where they say, it doesn't matter what you say, there is no truth. Everything, everybody is telling us that knowledge is all socially constructed and there's nothing objective about it. You really do have to have those conversations with them and challenge them and say, look, if there's no truth, then there's no truth to what you just said. And so it's kind of a non-starter, and go from there. But
Yeah.
I do think, as I talk to people, you just kind of have to go. You have to start with where they are, not with where you are.
Right.
And you may be ready to shovel down somebody's throat this favorite argument that you have for the faith, but it's not always appropriate, right? And I don't think
Yeah.
any of us want to shovel anything down somebody's throat because nobody's going to listen anyway. I think that we need to be able to have genuine conversations with people and see where they are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So now, the other thing that you mentioned, I think, because we promised to come back to this, this idea of fideism.
Yeah.
The,
Let's
the,
go there. That's great.
this is really important because I think that most religions are fideistic, and this just simply means that this is the view, excuse me, that says that we can't have we don't want to have reasons for faith. Faith is faith, and what that means is that you're taking a leap of faith,
Mm-hmm.
and there can be no reasons given for the faith. I was born and raised kind of that way. Being told, look, it's all about this experience, about this burning in the bosom, right? For example, a Mormon might have. But I don't want to just pick on Mormons here because I think it's important for listeners to know. Unfortunately, I think there's a lot of Christians like this too.
Right.
We're
Absolutely.
we're a very emotionally driven culture,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that can be very dangerous because what you're suggesting to people is that my belief system is really no better than yours probably. I just believe one thing, you believe another, and we're all good. And I
Right.
think that that's a tragedy for Christians because Christianity necessarily is different. And I know some of us may not want to accept that, but Christianity is necessarily different. It is based on an historical claim. If,
Yeah.
as Paul said, if Jesus is not risen from the dead, then we're just wasting our time. I mean,
Mm.
paraphrasing him, but that's what he was saying. We are
Yeah.
wasting our time and everybody else's time by preaching Jesus if he did not raise from the dead in history. Now, once you make that claim, once those disciples made those initial claims that they had seen the risen Jesus, it was from then on like no other religion in history or ever would be. So I think that we have to grapple with the historical nature of the faith. So
Yeah.
I think fideism is a troubling system. And the other thing I'll mention, I'll just put this little thing out. I wanted to tell you that Adam Francisco and I, who we all know Adam Francisco.
Yeah.
He's with 1517.
Right.
He's written quite a bit as well. Adam and I have started a podcast on this very thing, on faith and reason. It's called Faith and Reason
Great.
Exchange, and that starts, I believe, we're going to start releasing in August.
Okay.
We're recording now, and we'll be releasing every week. But that's all we deal with. This is the question we deal with every single week, is this issue of what relation does reason have to faith. And we'll examine the latest arguments. We'll examine historical arguments and just kind of cultural issues as well that bear on the topic. But yeah, I think it's an important point you make. We Christians really need to think this one through before they just say, it's all about emotional connection. It's all about emotions anyway. So
yeah. I don't want to spoil the podcast. That's great to know. And I'll make sure to link, if you guys have a link up to it in the show notes for that. But that is, I think I have so many questions about that. I think a lot of Christians actually are very confused about that relationship between faith and reason. Concerning fideism, could you kind of lay out like what that relationship looks like between faith and reason, and then where you kind of have landed on, because we're not suggesting that faith and reason are the same thing. We know that they're different. So how are we as Christians supposed to hold both of those, and even use both of those, knowing that they're not the same thing?
That's a really good question. And I think our first, Adam and I, our first podcast dealt precisely with this. This is all we dealt with in the first podcast. And I think that'll be the first one that airs in August. I think to answer that question, what we need to do is first ask, well, what is reason? And then what is faith?
Yeah.
Right? Because if we can't define the terms, we're going nowhere. And really the short of it is what we came down to. Look, reason it allows us to make informed judgments, right? It allows us to do calculations and draw conclusions about things. That's what reason is. Now, that's a very complex topic, and I know that there's some people out there who go, "Come on, that's superficial," but and perhaps it is. I mean, it is a complicated question. But when we talk about reason, we can't just talk about reason by itself, because reason implies knowledge. Reason implies those prior epistemological questions. And the epistemological questions are actually logically prior to the issue of what is reason. And those questions are simply, what is knowledge, right? How do we get it? Does it come through just me sitting and thinking, or does it come through looking around the world and making observations and doing experiments and that sort of thing? Those are the types of questions that you have to talk about when you're talking about reason. Now, when we talk about faith is, I think, historically considered to be trust, right?
Yeah.
When I'm putting my faith in something or somebody, I'm trusting somebody, and so these are not at odds. These simply are not at odds. And to say that they are, I think, is a gross misrepresentation of the relationship between these two things. And I would even go so far as to say that faith and reason need one another. They're like chocolate and peanut butter. For those of you who love chocolate and peanut, I do.
Yeah, I do too.
They need each other. And if you think about why they need each other, it's because if you have faith without reason, what you degenerate into is pure emotionalism. And pure emotionalism is really dangerous, right? It's really dangerous. If it's all about what I feel at any moment, well, good Lord, my emotions change all the time. I don't know about yours, but mine are constantly they're up and down, up and down. Without faith, reason becomes detached. It becomes cold. Reason needs faith to humble it, right?
Hmm.
It needs it to bring it to a state of humility, that it does not know everything, and that
Hmm.
it's has severe limitations. And I do
Yeah.
talk about these limitations in my new book.
Yes.
So, there are some hard, fast limitations to human knowledge, and we're never gonna get around them. This idea that one day we're going to achieve complete knowledge of everything in the universe is, and I do talk about this issue in the book, is preposterous in my opinion.
What
And
about AI?
the
How would AI play into that, in your opinion?
AI. Now you're talking to the software guy in me.
Yeah.
Um, well, look, we've done AI development here, and it's impressive what AI can do. But AI is always going to be limited too, because what AI can only output what we input into the system.
Okay.
And it's actually been shown that AI can actually give biased answers because the data that
Yes.
was fed into it originally is biased. And,
Right.
and again, when we're talking about bias, well, it's people hear the term bias, we're usually thinking racial bias and all. Yeah, maybe sometimes, yes, but that's not all we mean by bias. And what I'm talking
Right.
about bias is that simply the idea that the conclusion can be skewed in one direction or another. It could be
Mm-hmm.
politically, it could be socially, whatever. But
Theologically, yeah.
theologically, so yeah, AI is certainly no magic bullet. Never will be.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, it's going to be
Um,
limited to the people who input the information.
yeah, okay, that's helpful. It's not gonna take over the world, is what you're saying, and run
Well,
everybody.
that's so funny. I'm not a I don't think like that, and I kind of chuckle with that. This is because we always think Terminator 2, right? That's one of my
Right.
favorite movies is Terminator 2, and
Yeah.
that's how everybody talks. I'm not. It's certainly not out of the realm of possibility that we can create machines that will kill us. We've already done that with nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't put that past human beings. But that I don't spend my nights worrying about that sort of
Okay, that's good. Good to know.
thing. Yeah,
um,
yeah,
Me neither, at all. I'm not worried about it at all. So, we're talking about the relationship between faith and reason, and I think kind of what I've heard you say, and um, you know, what I've heard from others that are in similar circles is that reason is a, I think Luther even says, like, reason is a handmaid to faith. It's there to help it. And I see that for sure at the kind of overarching level of proving the validity of Christianity, as we've talked about, and those arguments. I'm curious how you see that relationship play out at more of a micro level where people are trying to figure out, okay, do I believe, and I guess this maybe just comes down to, what does the Bible say? Like, what do, what are we asserting as
yeah,
Christians? But the micro level of, like, what denomination should I be a part of? And how do I
yeah.
know that this tradition is more true than the other tradition? Do you think that that relationship between faith and reason has something to say there as well? And if so, what advice would you give to people to kind of figure that out for themselves?
Okay, that's an important question, and you're right. We have not touched on that. We've only touched on the question of, can faith play a role in validating Christian
Right.
belief, right?
Yeah.
So that's
Mm-hmm.
that's the prior question, but I think that that's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is just what you're mentioning. And that is, well, what role then does reason play as a Christian? I'm already a Christian, right? So let's say, okay, I think you're right. Let's just say, for sake of argument, so it says, I think you're right. This historical argument does give me a validation of my faith,
Mm-hmm.
but now I'm a Christian, and I'm no longer grappling with that prior issue. Now I'm grappling with, well, how does reason function for me as a Christian?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that reason plays a very critical role as a Christian. To go back to what I said, faith and reason they need each other. If
Mm.
I dispense with reason, then my faith is going to turn it's going to turn into emotionalism. There's nowhere else
Yeah.
for it to go. If there's no anchor, if there's no bringing my emotions and those sorts of things about me into check, right? So they have to have one another. And I think that one thing that reason has done, and this can be shown throughout the history of the Christian church, and Adam and I in one of our podcasts talk about this very thing. And in terms of, well, where do we see it in church history, right?
Mm.
Forget my life. Where do we see this interplay
Yeah.
of the interplay of faith and reason in church history? And one of the places that I brought up was the Council of Nicaea. This was a really critical time in church
Mm.
history, and the Council of Nicaea is, roughly 325,
Right.
and they were grappling with They were grappling with certain heresies that led into this. Some people had said, well, Jesus isn't really divine. He's a great guy, but he's not divine. Other people were saying, and by the way, if he's not divine, of course, his death means nothing for me, and it means nothing for any
Right.
of us,
Yeah.
right? Because if he's not divine, there can be no satisfaction of sin.
Mm-hmm.
Other people were saying, well, he's not human, right? He's divine, but he's not really human. He just appears to
Mm-hmm.
be human. And so you had these different strains coming into the Council of Nicaea, and this was a critical time in church history to really nail these things out.
Yeah.
And reason played a critical role. I mean, the fathers even used some philosophical terms that they inherited from Greek philosophy
Right.
to
Mm-hmm.
to talk about the idea of Jesus's personhood. And
Yeah.
so the idea that we could even get started by thinking about theological issues without reason is itself a non-starter. We
Yeah.
can't.
Yeah.
We can't. We have to think not only theologically, but philosophically as well. And I know that
Hmm.
this would probably give some theologians, heartburn to hear me say, but there's no getting around it, because you want the strongest evidence. Go back to the councils. Go back to the early
Yes.
councils that all
Yeah.
of us hold so dearly, right? Not just Catholics. It's
Right.
Lutherans. It's the Calvinists too, who hold these
Yeah.
councils as near and dear.
Mm-hmm.
There may be some Christians who don't really care about them, but throughout church history, these have been pretty definitive councils.
Yeah.
And what they decided in those councils is that, look, we're not going to get stuck in this trap of this either or trap. Either Jesus was
Yeah.
divine or he wasn't. Either he was
Mm-hmm.
human or he wasn't. They said, look, based on not just scriptural tradition, but based on church tradition, and because that, like it or not, it was a big thing, right? We had there was tradition that stood behind that, and they said, based on all of this, Christians have universally believed he was both 100%. He was both
Mm-hmm.
100% divine and 100% human. Now,
Yeah.
can we fully understand that? Can we fully understand the implications that it has for a Trinitarian view of God, which the Council of Nicaea affirmed? No, we're never going to be
Right.
able to completely understand that, but we try to more and more understand that. And that's what reason does, right? It,
Mm.
it, it lays out with greater fullness the intelligibilities already found in the doctrines of faith. So we're
Yes.
we're fleshing them out, and
Yeah.
I believe that that's incumbent on each generation to be able to speak those afresh to every generation. Not that we're reinventing the wheel. That's not what I'm
Right.
saying, but that
Yeah.
we do need to speak the language of today's generation, which goes back to your prior question. Well, how do I talk to somebody?
Yeah.
Well,
Right.
we talk to them by understanding how they think,
Yeah.
and I think that to do so, this is the role of reason, right? It's not
Yeah.
just faith, and that's faith and reason. They have to have each other.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I had I don't know if you know Dr. Philip Carey on a few months ago. He recently wrote a book on the Nicene Creed, and he kind of, I feel like you're echoing some similar thoughts in this idea of like the use of philosophical terms was used by people at the Council of Nicaea because that's what they had. Like that's
Yes.
the tool that they had to use, and that's a great example of God given reason at work. And so to completely fault philosophy or throw it out the door is not probably in our favor, but to also realize we need to keep it in check. And like you've said so many times, which I think is really helpful for people, especially today, that knowledge and reason is limited. We
Yeah.
kind of have to hold both of those things in tension. And I think maybe we need to wrap up soon, but
Yeah.
that this idea, we've talked a lot about it already, but this idea that knowledge is limited, I think it's a kind of basic idea, but I do think people struggle with that today because of maybe it's technology or AI, or even, I don't know, is it left over from like the Enlightenment and this idea that we can continue to improve? Um,
Yeah.
where have you seen that kind of continue to rear its head, and what, if you had to give one argument against it, again, this might be just really basic, but what would you tell people to kind of argue like, no, it's limited, we're not going to ever know everything?
Yeah. So, but you brought up the Enlightenment. Adam and I, I know this is another one we had, I think, an entire podcast on. But
Okay.
where did this idea come from? And I
Yeah.
think that partly it does come from the Enlightenment, because the Enlightenment was a period, and the Enlightenment was 17th century to the 19th century for the hearers who may
Yes.
not know that historical period. But the Enlightenment had this notion that we we need to emancipate human reason from church dogma. We need to emancipate it from tradition. We need to emancipate reason from anything that came from our ancestors. And we need to start fresh.
Mm.
Rethink all this. And they came, and it almost was like they were viewing reason as being omnicompetent, right?
Hmm.
It like it had no limitations. It could do everything. And of course, it's a nonsensical notion, because because reason simply is not omnicompetent, and there's no sense in which we can emancipate ourselves completely from traditions. No
Yeah.
way. And we can't do it in science, especially because if
Hmm.
you think about how science functions, and just this is a plug for where I'm going next. But and I deal a little bit with in what can we really know, but you cannot start from nothing. You have to start with the questions of the day in science, right? You
Yeah.
start
Yeah.
from the tradition of science. Science itself has a very strong tradition. If it didn't, it could not proceed. We
Hmm.
wouldn't have the discoveries today that we had without very strong traditions. And so there's one reason why reason cannot be considered omnicompetent. It simply cannot.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in terms of your question of, well, can are we going to get to the point where we really don't, we just know everything? Not even possible, because every
Hmm.
question that we seem to answer necessarily then implies new questions that are left unanswered. It's what Immanuel Kant called question propagation. Every answer that's given is now going to engender new questions, and it will forever be that way, right?
Yeah.
And that's why there's just no way of getting around the fact, I think, that human reason, human knowledge will always be limited.
Is there something about faith that you would say is certain in a way that reason isn't? Or is
I
that?
do, yeah, I do think that faith, you know, faith can bring a certainty that that reason doesn't have.
Yeah.
And I would say that because it's supernatural, right?
Right.
No, an atheist is not going to, they're probably going to go, I don't believe that. Well, fine. But I can still provide ample reasons for my faith for the atheist. So I can still give the atheist, hey, these are really good reasons why I put my faith in this Jesus, right?
Mm-hmm.
In this person that I believe is fully God and fully man, as the
Mm-hmm.
Nicene Creed states. But yes, I do believe faith does give certainty, and it is because it's the Holy Spirit. We as Christians, confess that is the work of the Holy Spirit, and I
Yeah.
believe that does give a certainty. Now, that
Yeah.
doesn't mean that, I think that we need to point out, that doesn't mean that as I go through my Christian life, I'm always certain, right?
Right.
We're
Yeah.
all in this, we're all suspended between certainty and doubt. We are
Yeah.
all suspended between those two. And we're all going to have to grapple with those at one point or another in our life, if not daily. If you get a personality like me, I'd say I deal with this daily,
Yeah.
not once a decade, because that's just kind of the person I am. So, yeah, I would say, yeah, faith can give us certainty, but I think it's important for people to understand the Christian faith is no cakewalk, right?
Right.
It's a challenge, and it's something that one of my favorite writers, G.K. Chesterton, pointed out.
Mm.
This is not an easy thing. But I do believe, yeah, it does give certainty, and it does pull us through, gives us a hope that seems to be beyond myself, that pulls me through those challenges.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, when you talk about faith and trust being equal, there's a sure footing to trust that
Mm-hmm.
is helpful. Yeah. I think this whole conversation about the relationship between faith and reason has helped just kind of give me a light bulb, because I think we want to say faith is certain, but then we get wary of how that will be taken. And I think
Yeah.
bringing in this idea that reason is limited, but essential, is very helpful there to kind of give us a more balanced approach. So thank you for bringing that up. That was at least very helpful for me, and so I'm sure it'll be helpful for others as well.
Yeah.
Well, as we're finishing up, David, you've mentioned you're working on your next book. Can you tell us a little bit about what that's going to be about, and anything else you're working on that we should kind of keep an eye out for?
The next book I'm working on is, well, what is tradition? And
Okay.
I'm really taking, we tend to, in this culture, we've tended to since the Enlightenment, really, and especially since Darwin's publication of The Origin, we've kind of been bred on this idea that anything traditional is considered backwards and regressive, and that the idea of progress is the only thing that matters, right?
Right. Yeah.
And to progress, one must reject everything that came before.
Yeah.
We just got to wholesale reject it. Now, in this book, I'm going to argue that's simply nonsensical.
Mm.
It's not even, you can't even move one step ahead of you without relying on the traditions that have gone before you. And I think that Christians also rely on traditions that went way before us. And so there's no getting around it. And I think that we tend to poo-poo the idea of tradition. And I think it's wrong-headed. And we need to come back to a little bit more balanced view of tradition. And I think to do that, I want to talk about tradition and science, because everybody wants to use science as the sort of ultimate example of what human beings are capable of. And so,
Yeah.
okay, well, let's talk about it. Where would
Yeah.
science be without tradition? And I don't think it would be, certainly wouldn't be where we are.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of where I'm going with the
That's
next
awesome.
book. And to be honest, it dovetails what I just did and what can we really know. It's kind of a
Yeah.
natural outcome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It seems like everything you've kind of written about is incongruence or following the same track in different ways. So that's
Yeah.
great. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I thank you for popcorning all these questions that we did bounce around a lot, but I had fun, and
It's fun.
yeah, I think this is going to be really great for people. So I appreciate your time, and I'm excited for the new podcast. That's awesome.
Yeah,
I'm
it'll be
going to
fun.
definitely be listening in when that launches next month.
Perfect.
Awesome. Thank you, David. Thanks so much for listening to today's conversation. If you liked this conversation and you haven't done so already, please consider leaving me a 5-star review wherever you're listening to this podcast. If you are listening on YouTube and you like today's conversation, I would also encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can do so by just clicking the button below. It should also be linked in the show notes. That way you are sure to not miss any of the future content that comes out every other week from me, Kelsi Climbera, and Outside Ourselves. Thanks as always for listening, and I'll see you back here in a couple of weeks.